Hey budget nerds, welcome to part 2 of the Stang Audio Install. In part 1, I showed how to install a Kenwood head unit into a 2006 to 2009 Mustang. If you want to see it, the link's below. This video will cover the installation of the amplifier under the rear deck and the building and installing of a custom subwoofer box. If you want to do the same thing in your car or just want to follow along, then stay tuned. Now keep in mind, I'm not a car audio professional. I am also not a professional speaker box builder. But the point of this video is to show you one way it could be done and to show you don't have to be to get something that looks nice and works well. However, when working with car electronics, use caution, use the proper gauge wire, and disconnect the battery before you start. If you want to follow along, I have links to some of the items I used in this video if it's helpful. If you go way back in time on my channel, you'll see a horn-loaded subwoofer box I built. I only used it a few times and figured I'd repurpose it for this project. And I mean repurposing the speaker, not the box. Here is the Kenwood KFC W2512, 1000 watt peak, 300 watt RMS, 4 ohms, it'll do. The amp I chose is the Rockville DB12. It's certified at 300 watts RMS at 4 ohms, so should be perfect. The amp also came with a wiring kit. It has a power cable, ground cable, speaker wire, remote wire, fuse, and a few other trinkets. I don't want to dive into part picking, there are plenty of videos out there on that topic, but make sure you get the proper wire gauge for the power you'll be handling. I looked up the info for the speaker, and sealed, this speaker does well in 1 cubic foot of space. I haul a lot of stuff and still need my trunk. Some people will use fiberglass to custom form a speaker box to an area of their trunk, but yeah, I'm not one of those people. I made a sample box on subbox.pro to get a rough size for the box, and then worked out some paper template to get a rough shape. Then I cut it into a shape that would be easier to build, and I think that'll work just fine. I then did a bit of math to make sure the dimensions would be ideal, taller instead of wider to maximize trunk space. I used 3/4 inch MDF and began marking and cutting. I won't bore you with the details, but it's important to make sure you measure twice and cut once. Work out the pieces you'll need and work out the dimensions. If you have the right tools, this goes much smoother, but special tools aren't really needed to get a good result. Your sub-spec sheet will show you how large the cutout for the speaker should be. Drill a hole to start and then use a jigsaw to cut it out. It's a perfect fit. Next, I glued and screwed the pieces together. I later came back and countersunk the screws to make sure they were flush. Once it dried, I sanded the seams and edges to make it neater and to round the corners. I also cut out a circle in the back for the connector cup. Before putting on the top, I caulked all the seams to make it as airtight as I could. I countersunk and pre-drilled the screws to fasten the top. Next was the carpeting. The carpet wasn't an exact match to my Mustang's carpet, but it'll work. I was pretty excited for this part. I've never carpeted a box before. I used spray glue, which made this a whole lot easier. Just make sure you're slow and careful with your cuts, and it's not too bad. Cutting out the speaker hole was also pretty fun. Fits perfectly and looks pretty cool, if you ask me. Off camera, I had soldered on some speaker wire that came in the wire kit to the connector cup, and then fastened it to the box. Next, I connected said wires to the sub, and then fastened the speaker to the box. The grill needed some spacers, but once it was attached, I think it turned out pretty good. Well, let's set the box aside for now. Let's get the amp installed. Here's the amp. Again, it's a Rockville DB12. They're a budget brand with a pretty good rep. This amp should be perfect for the speaker I'm using. As mentioned, I'm mounting it under the rear deck to keep it out of the way. I gave its exposure to heat here some thought, but decided just to do it. Leave your complaints in the comments. If you own an S197 Stang and want to install your amp here, let's go over what you need to remove. I want to mount it right, not there, but under the deck, in the trunk, just under there. In order to get this panel or carpet off the top of the deck, you got to pull off this panel here. Obviously I did this one already, just to be sure. But to pull off this one, which I'll show you, you got a peg right there. You got one right there. You got to pop that little guy off. And a screw behind there, I'll show you. And then you got to work this piece out from under here. And then there's one right here. So let's get to it. Once the panel is out, you want to remove these two pegs and two identical ones on the other side. Work the seatbelt strap out through the slits, and then it should lift and pull out. At this point, I started running wires where they needed to go, but remember, hooking up the main power cable to the battery is the last thing you should do. I'm a sucker for a good template, so I made one for the amp as well. It made finding the perfect spot and marking the holes much easier. I drilled the holes off camera. Clean up your mess though, because you now have metal shavings. I dropped screws through silicone spacers to help with noise and vibration, and then used nuts to fasten the amp. I used silicone spacers here as well to help with noise, vibration, and heat. It's a good idea to use some thread lock on those nuts so they don't slowly back out on you. On to wiring, I made my ground cable with the 4-gauge wire in the kit. Keep it short and fasten one end to the car at a nearby bolt or something that's close to the amp. Make sure you sand all the finish, paint, and primer away. You want the ground cable to touch bare metal. At this point, I had unplugged the battery and then plugged in the cables coming from the head unit, including the remote wire. I talked about this a bit more in part 1, link below. I connected the power, ground, and the subwire. You can see I sanded this area and added a bolt to use for the ground. It worked perfect. Last part is to connect the power wire to the battery. We need to punch a hole through a grommet or find a hole in the firewall to run it. It's not necessary, but it's easier in the S197 Mustangs to remove the battery for this part. There's a pretty convenient place to use just below the battery and to the right. I drilled a hole in the grommet and then taped up the wire to the drill bit and pulled. If you don't have a long drill bit, you can just use anything to stick through the hole to fish the wire with. After pulling the slack through, it's a good idea to protect any wires in the engine bay from heat. My wiring kit came with this sleeve to do just that. When it comes to the power cable, you want to make sure you use a fuse. Place it in line as close to the battery as you can. My wiring kit came with one, and is actually my only complaint about this kit. The fuse totally works, but didn't play nice with the wire crimp sleeves I tried to use. The idea is to run a short wire from the battery terminal to the fuse, and from the fuse to the amp. Now that it's all installed, let's hook up the speaker. While adjusting the gain level for the amp, I think I snapped off the plastic gain knob when accidentally turning it the wrong way. It's a pretty weak piece of plastic, but I was able to get the volume where I wanted it. Rockville, if you're listening, make those knobs a bit more robust, would you? Alright, all installed. Let's see what it sounds like. won't blow trees over, but it does look nice and sounds great, and it adds a really nice punch to my music. Well, hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you have questions, let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.